This podcast was produced by OAR FM Dunedin with support from New Zealand On Air.
Kia ora, assalamu alaikum. Welcome to another episode of Headscarves and Good Yarns. This episode, we're talking about systems thinking. I know it is a little bit nerdy, a little bit academic, but I promise you, I'm gonna hold your hand. This is gonna be like systems thinking 101, and we're going to, I'm gonna unpack why it's important that we think about things from a more systemic point of view, and kind of outline the key steps in thinking about, well, how is it that you look at this world from a more systemic point of view? Thank you for tuning in. I hope you enjoy.
Welcome to Headscarves and Good Yarns with me, Amal Abdullahi. The show is all about talking about race, diversity, and everything in between, all in the hopes of empowering a more empathetic Aotearoa. We talk about all these huge life things through the lens of people's lives and stories. I hope every yarn you take a wee gem from it and expands your heart and mind just a wee bit more.
You know, there are so many reasons why I wanted to make this episode, but the biggest reason why I really wanted to make this episode today is the more that I think about the state of this world and just the conversations that we're having, and particularly the quality of the conversations that we're having. Well, they're not really that they don't really hold a lot of quality. I think that's what I'm just trying to say. There's not a lot of productive conversation. I think, you know, whether it's in person or whether it's happening around me or whether it's online, I just feel like the main takeaway that I get from a lot of the conversations that happen around me around, you know, the big things that are happening in our world at the moment, is I think we've kind of missed the point, or we have, I think, gotten so caught up in labels and so caught up in like this whole left versus right binary that there is no way of really having a productive conversation. I think personally, when I think about conversations that are productive, I'm not saying that everyone has to agree and will agree. I just don't think that is the goal, especially if that's, you know, the chances of that happening are not very high. But I think what marks a really productive conversation is, were you able to investigate your values? Were you able to investigate the lens in which you look through this world? Were you able to understand a little bit deeper the systems that we interact with? Were you able to explore the nuances more? Were you able to acknowledge yours and others' intersectionality? Were you able to acknowledge our interconnectedness a bit more? And I understand that these are like hella big questions, and you might not consciously be thinking about these questions or thinking about answering them in the moment. Because again, they are really big questions. But yeah, when I think about productive conversations about the state of our world and what's happening, that's what I really think of as markers of a productive conversation. And I think this is just me and my personal observations of the, you know, conversations that's happening around me, is that this left and right binary has been pushed so much that there's no longer room to have these types of conversations. It's like this us versus them. And, you know, I understand that having language to describe how you think about the world is really important. But I think they stop becoming so helpful or important when it's just used as a characterization, and then there's no longer a productive conversation about it. Like, this is something that I will get to later in the episode. But, you know, with the comments that Timothy Paul, Green MP, has made about the beat police, the way that the other politicians in the House completely, you know, characterized and then her point of view and then use that to dismiss was insane. You know, Tamitha brought up some really, you know, valid comments about the beat police. And then I can't remember exactly word for word. This is just coming off the top of my head, so I really could be wrong in remembering this. But I think, you know, David Seymour said something along the lines of like, well, you know, in some other world, what would Tamitha like if she doesn't like the police or something like that? And the way that was said, it really, the vibes that it was giving, it was giving, if, you know, Tamitha doesn't like the police so much, then in her alternative crazy world, what is she implying that we go with? And that makes, and I feel like this happens a lot to those, you know, labeled as progressive or being on the left side. Is like they're characterized as just like a hella crazy people who are not rooted in reality. And so because that's the case, there's no way that anything that they could ever say would be productive or true, or, you know, it just is insane. And, you know, I could be wrong in, you know, quoting what David Seymour said, but the effect of his words were very much felt. And when I just see comments like that, I'm like, bruh, how are we meant to be having productive conversations, or nuanced conversations about everything? And then I was thinking, well, you know, I wonder how productive our conversations would be if we all did a bit more systems thinking. And I am a self-confessed nerd, and I think I subconsciously, until before I came across the term systems thinking, I think it was something that was like ruminating in the back of my head, but I just didn't realize that there was a whole term for it. And there's like, you know, researched models and systems, and people have researched into systems thinking. And I think that sense of subconsciously, or, you know, knowing what systems thinking is, or having it in the back of my mind, I think just goes to show that just in my lived experience that I was perceiving these systems. And that's, you know, something that I'll get to later in this episode as well. But when I went to this thing called the Social Experiment many moons ago, I think it was back in 2019, and it's like a personal, a professional, transformational, like development leadership weekend thingy. And, you know, you go through systems thinking, you go through human, centered design thinking. So you have like more tools to add to your toolkit. But then another cool thing about it was that, you know, if people aren't empowered in themselves to feel like they can't make that change, you know, that's a missed opportunity. And so there was an element of like personal development as well. So kind of looking into your limiting beliefs and creating like new empowering beliefs about who you are as a person. So it was really, really cool. And the thing that really made my brain just light up was the whole systems thinking. And it's this way of thinking about the world in a way where you're thinking about the interconnectedness and the interactions within a system, and just thinking about the system as a whole. And I thought that was really cool, because when you are thinking about things from a systemic level, it just acknowledges the interconnectedness of all of our lives. And I think when we want to think about the world in a more curious and empathetic way, like, that's a huge key ingredient of it, just acknowledging our interconnectedness. And I think a lot of the systems that we live in right now, it's built in a way, or designed in a way, where we forget about that fact that we are interconnected, and we do live together, and we all kind of interact within the same systems. And I also thought that systems thinking was awesome, because it naturally encourages you to consider your lived experience, but also learn how to be an observer and just really perceive and observe the system. And when you're in that position, you're thinking about your privileges, lack thereof, other people's privileges, lack thereof, other people's interactions with the systems. You're thinking about the impact gaps. And I think when you're thinking about things from that level, it's amazing how deep you can go. And I think, like, if you ever want to have any kind of solution to anything, the level of, or the quality, of the solution very much depends on the quality of the question that you're asking in the first place. So I really love systems thinking. And I think when I thought about this, this particular episode and what is it that I wanted to talk about, I really wanted this episode to be in response to just how I've been feeling in terms of, like, just noticing the lack of productive conversations that I've been observing anyway, just, around me, in the online space. It sounds really common sense, right? But I don't think that we're having a lot of quality conversations that kind of acknowledge the nuance and the complexity and the systems that are kind of behind the issues that we're trying to tackle. So I wanted this episode to kind of be in response to that. And of course, this is just kind of like a systems thinking 101, if you will. I think this is an introduction, and I hope that I can get more into systems thinking on the show here. But yeah, think of this as an introduction. So what the heck is a system to begin with? And a system it can show up in so many different ways. Like, our system can be an institute, say, for example, like our parliament. It can be like our health system. Those are institutes. It could be our economy. Our system is our culture, whether it's celebrity culture, our own, individual cultures. A system can be, a set of, values or like attitudes or beliefs that as a society we operate from. It can be race, it can be our planet. Like, all of these things are an example of a system. I think even within our own body, we are our own system. And the insane thing about all of these systems is that they are all linked together. They are all linked together. None of these systems work in isolation. And so, yeah, a system can be broken down into many things. And I think if you, like, even, you don't have to do it right now, but just, when you've got some time, just like whether you write it down or you're just doing it mentally, think about just any issue, whether it's in your personal life or whether it's something that you read about in the news or something that, is happening in the world. Just think about any issue. Doesn't matter how small or big. And when you note down what that issue is or event is, just think about all of the systems that are involved with that, event or issue that you have listed. There are so many, and there are so many systems, or there will be so many that you will think of, and it just goes to show like how interconnected our systems are. And I think it's really important that we think about systems when we are thinking about what's going on in our world, because all of the, a lot of the issues or isms that we are grappling with in this world are by design. They are not there by accident or by a coincidence. They are there by design. For example, the way that our economy is set up, it is set up, by that, well, again, correct me if I'm wrong, but just the way that I've understood the economy, it's set up in a way where it's like, I have money because there is a debt that exists. Or, there's some kind of deficit somewhere. And because there is that deficit, someone is gaining off of that deficit. We are kind of based on a debt-based economy. It's not like we're based on a circular economy. And so, there are so many issues that kind of come with a economy design like that. You think of racism, that hasn't come about by any accident or coincidence. If you think back to, the establishment of America, if you think back to just even colonization, like a lot of those slavery, colonization, a lot of those, a lot of that was the horrible acts committed under those umbrellas were legitimized by this false idea that there is a superior race, that those who are white are superior to those who are black, essentially. It sounds insane saying that out loud in 2025, but that's facts, okay? And because there was this false legitimacy put on that idea, then it then gave legitimacy for slavery, for colonization. And you can see how that persists now with the racism that we have, the discrimination that comes with that, and how that has been enabled and been able to, keep on unfortunately thriving because of the system of white supremacy that we live in. That is a system that very much exists. And so, again, a lot of these problems are not by accident. They are actively there by the design of the system that we exist in. I think that's the main point that I really want to highlight in this episode, is that, a lot of these isms are by design. Poverty, racism, Islamophobia, these are the ones that just immediately come top of mind. But any ism is by design. And I think when we all understand that, I'm curious as to how that would change the quality of our conversations that we're having. And so when you think about, system thinking, I suppose the first step of, moving through this world with more of a systems thinking lens is the ability to perceive or, observe systems. And that is a complicated skill, one that asks you to be open-minded, to be curious, to be empathetic, to literally think in a way that you haven't before. I think to, observe and perceive systems, you have to learn how to think about things while being on the margin. You have to learn how to observe. You have to learn how to understand the complexity and the layers. So it's not just thinking about the system as a whole. You're thinking about the interconnectedness. You're thinking about the interactions within a system. You're thinking about, the relations that system has with other systems. Like it's a whole ass thing. It is a whole ass thing. And it's complicated. It isn't easy. And I think a thing that while we're talking about this that's really coming to mind is that when it comes to systems thinking, it's very confronting. Because you're really looking at, things are just laid out for you. And sometimes it's really hard observations to process and to understand. And, I think, I've definitely said this on the show before, but this type of work, it's never easy. It's really easy to feel uncomfortable. It's quite easy to feel that sense of shame, to feel that sense of guilt. And the thing that I really want to emphasize with this type of thinking is that it's never there to point fingers at people. A couple of episodes ago, we were talking about othering, and we were talking about the symptoms of white culture, and how, my little disclaimer there very much applies here, where it's not about pointing fingers. It's not to turn it back to people. That's really not the point at all. I think the whole point of this is that, this is about talking about our system and unpacking the system. We're not here to perceive or observe people like that. We're here to do that to the system, because the system is the source of the problem. Really, if you think about it like that, because if there are, any isms, or if there are any issues or events or whatever that we want to unpack, it's there by the design of the system. So we're here to perceive that system. We're not here to point any fingers at anyone. That's really not what the vibes are here, okay? And I think another really important thing to talk about when we are talking about perceiving or observing systems is that, and again, I'm so open to having a kōrero about this. This, again, is just my 2 cents, but I think our ability to observe or perceive systems is very much linked to, or it's in relationship with, how comfortable we are with our privilege. And again, every single time I talk about privilege, I will always put this disclaimer out there. I understand that we are all complex people, and depending on the context or the environment that we're in, we're going to have a different set of privileges or lack thereof. And then there will be some people who, will be kind of on because if you think about this as like a bell curve, most of us in the middle, depends on the context. There will be some spaces where we do have the privilege and some spaces that we don't. And then if you think about the bell curve, there's always the tips of the bell curve. And so there may be some people out there who, even in their complex being and even amongst all the different contexts, they may have all the privilege. And then on the other end of the bell curve, there will be some people, despite all the different contexts, and the nuances there, most of the time will end up not having a lot of privilege at all. I just really want to put the disclaimer out there that, there is that reality out there when it comes to privilege. And, your ability to see your privilege is very much linked to how we can observe and perceive systems. For example, and I think this is what I was saying earlier in the episode, I think this is the reason why systems thinking, before I knew that there was a term for it, that type of thinking was always ruminating in the back of my mind, is that, there are some contexts where I don't have a lot of privilege. And I think if that's something, if there are contexts where you don't have privilege, then you inherently understand that living in this system, this system is not in your favor. And when you realize or understand, not even understand, you don't need to understand if you're living through it, that's your lived experience. It's like, you ain't never gonna need to explain racism to a black person. Actually, maybe I won't say never. I take that. As soon as that came out of my mouth, I was like, hold up. And then I just got flashbacks of conversations that I have had with POC who just really, just because of their lived experience and their privilege, have really not felt the effects of racism. So let me reel that back. But, most often or not, you're not going to have to explain to a POC about racism, right? So if you're living in a system that isn't in your favor, you are low-key already perceiving. You are perceiving because of that fact that this system is not for you. And if you do have that privilege, it's kind of like this, you're kind of being bubble wrapped in a sense, because you're not feeling the effects of living in a system that isn't in your favor, right? And so to perceive a system and, see the system for its whole, which means seeing that system outside of your privilege and seeing that system outside of your lived experience, means you are going to have to learn to unpack your privilege. And And I think that's a really important thing to mention when we are talking about perceiving, or observing systems, because that is kind of the first step when it comes to, learning how to think about the world that we live in a systematic way. Perceiving is really, really important. And so I think understanding your privilege is really important. And I think I can only ever speak for myself 100% on the show, and that is what I'm going to do now. But I think, there are many identities that I have where I'm like, damn, I'm perceiving because I'm perceiving that the system ain't for me. With me being a person of color, with me being Black, with me living with whilst wearing a hijab in a non-Muslim country, growing up with not a lot of money. But then there are also many ways where I do have privilege. And I've had to really learn how to, I think because in many ways I don't have that privilege. I think for me personally, it was kind of, it was low-key strange to acknowledge that, there are some contexts where you do have that privilege. I think that was really a bit strange for me to unpack that, because not that I loved not having the privilege, or I loved being a victim, but I think I was just that was my norm. That I wasn't until I really got into systems thinking that I was like, hold up, that's not actually the case for you, everywhere you go. And I, really had to pop that comfort bubble wrap that my privilege gave me. And it was honestly wild how much more I was able to perceive and observe systems after I popped that comfort bubble wrap. And also after I popped that comfort bubble wrap, how much more I was able to comfortably be observer. And I think that's another thing that collectively we're just not the greatest at. I think just observing. And it sounds as silly saying that out loud, but again, just from the lack of productive and quality conversations that we're having, I'm just none of us know how to, none of us have observed really, and I think if we were more comfortable being observers, we would be able to see the nuances a lot more, would be able to understand, that whole interconnectedness and how we may have different interactions within the same system. And another thing that I also would like to say about perceiving or observing systems is that there are many different ways that you can do this. This can be done in community. This can be done in kōrero. This can be done in education. This can be done within yourself, whether it's journaling or reflecting, or this can be done with your immediate family, this can be done with your friends, this can be done with reading books or watching documentaries. There are a lot of different ways that one can observe or perceive. It can also be done by challenging yourself, challenging the media sources that you're consuming, questioning where your education is coming from, where your wisdom or your knowledge is coming from. There are a lot of different ways that one can observe or perceive systems. But all I gotta say, just like systems thinking, even just at the observing, perceiving level, there are layers to it, honey. It's not just A to B type of thing. We're going everywhere all at once at the same time with observing and perceiving systems. And this is an active thing that that life is going to continually ask you to keep on doing forever and ever, because things are always changing. Nothing is ever stagnant. And I think it's important to remain open to that. And I think the last thing that I want to say about perceiving or observing systems is that, data is important, but data is not the same as like your wisdom or your knowledge or like your lived experience. And I think this kind of goes back to the point that we think not only with our brain, but we think with our heart, and with our heart comes our fears and doubts and concerns and worries and like our lived experience. And we think about our immediate community. And there's, nothing inherently wrong with that. That is a very human response. But, as I've said in previous episodes, is that it's normal to have these feelings, but like if you're not aware of it, it's really easy for the systems that we live in to condition your fears. I mean, if we, for example, immediately after 9/11, naturally there were a lot of very valid human emotions around after such an event and such a tragedy. But the Islamophobia that took off, god damn, absolutely insane. And that fear and that anger, definitely conditioned by the systems that we were living in to kind of breed that Islamophobia, which is still a thing to this very day. And so I think it's really important to when you're observing, perceiving systems, and you're doing that by, listening to podcasts and watching documentaries and reading books and getting that information, that, that data is really important, but data doesn't move on its own. Do you know what I mean? Like, we need to give significance to that data. And we often do that when we put our wisdom or our knowledge or our heart with that data too. And so I think it's really important to mention that and keep that in mind for when you're perceiving and observing systems. Another systems thinking 101 thing that I really want to highlight is the concept of a wicked problem. And a wicked problem is, in systems thinking, is problems that are really hard to solve because it's so complicated and so nuanced and interconnected by its nature. And so I think, human nature, we really like easy solutions, or easy in the sense that, we can put it in a box and fold it away nice and neatly. But a wicked problem is a social or cultural issue that is hard to define, and then because it's hard to define, it is hard to solve because it's of its interconnected nature, and there's not a lot of clear solutions out there. And this could be like climate change, for example. It could be poverty. It could be and I know this is something that we've been talking about a lot in Aotearoa at the moment, but, our healthcare system. And I think this fear of, the quote unquote wicked problem has also contributed to the lack of quality or productive conversations that we're having. Like if we go back to the Tamitha Paul example, and I think this is, what's happened recently, and just even the conversations around that, I was like, damn, these are all like hella unproductive conversations. But if we think back to, or just any conversation to do with our policing system, our justice system, or our prison system, I think there's a lot of unproductive conversations that happen around that, because I think all of these things can be characterized as a wicked problem. And because there's no easy or clear-cut solution to it, instead of kind of tackling that and facing that head on, there are efforts made, whether it's subconscious or consciously, if it's made to kind of minimize the problem in such a way where we don't acknowledge the complex nature of it. For example, even with David Seymour's response to Tamitha Paul's comments, just trying to imply the, for Tamitha Paul to make very valid comments about the beat police, and for David Seymour's response to be, what world does Tamitha Paul live in, or what is she expecting that we do instead, is insane, because of course it's a complicated problem in the sense that it's not just about, we're talking about the policing system here. It's, we're talking about the history of discrimination, the racism that's there. Just in general, it can link up to the conversations that we're having about, community care and doing things in a different way. And those are all valid conversations to be having, and conversations that are worth having as well. But when, David Seymour makes comments like that, it just completely throws out the window, the nuance, and it's valid that it's a nuanced and complex challenge. It just takes away all of that complexity. And I don't know, for me, I'm hearing a lot of fear of if it's not what we have now, what are we meant to be doing? And it's like, dude, I don't know if anyone out there has all of the issues, but the reality is that the current one, the system is not designed for everyone. It doesn't serve everyone. So what would it look like if we did have a system that served everyone? It is a little bit scary in the sense that there's no clear-cut solution to this, but I really do think the solution lies in that hard conversation. Damn, just imagine if we all perceived and observed systems together and had a conversation about that. That would be so cool, but I just don't think that's possible, because we're not really having productive conversations about it. And the thing with the wicked problem is that it can be really hard to find a agreement, and because it involves so many things. It involves so many systems, and then there's complexity that comes from that, the nature of the interconnectedness. And another thing about a wicked problem is that it involves conflicts of values. And there's so many diverse perspectives and lived experiences involved. And there are so many conflicting interpretations. We are observing different things, essentially. And so what wicked problems ask of us is to have ongoing learning and adaptations, And we can't have that ongoing learning or adaptation if we're not having productive conversations about it. And I think if we want to have those productive conversations, we need to learn how to identify patterns and relationships and think about the points in the system where we can leverage things to make some difference in addressing these wicked problems. And so again, I'm sorry to keep bringing this back up, but like, imagine if David Seymour had said something along the lines of like, forget about David Seymour. If any of the politicians in the House responded to Tamitha Paul's comments of like, what you're saying does have some validity to it. Let's all come together, despite the fact that we all come from different parties and have different viewpoints, let's come together and let's talk about the patterns and relationships and maybe start talking about some leverage points within, our legislation. How productive would that be? But, when there's comments that completely reduce what Tamitha Paul has said and make her seem like some lunatic, there's no way of having productive conversations like that now, is there? And I think the last thing that I want to finish on when it comes to systems thinking, because, when it comes to solving wicked problems, which I think a lot of the isms in our world, they are wicked problems, talking about patterns and relationships and leverage points are key, because as I said before, like the quality of the solution really depends on the quality of the question. So if you're not really identifying patterns and relationships and leverage points, they're just going to be quick fixes. They're just going to be Band-Aid solutions. And one model that I was first introduced to for systems thinking, and something that I still use to this day, in terms of systems thinking, is the iceberg model. And the iceberg model, is based on this idea that when you're looking at the tip of the iceberg, it's literally only the tip. And most of the iceberg is submerged under water. And so if you think about our wicked problems, if you think about events, if you think about any challenges, that's kind of like what you can see, that's the tip of the iceberg. But then you ask yourself deeper questions. You get to realize that this iceberg, the tip of this iceberg, is not just randomly floating in the ocean. It's something that is supported by our systems that we engage with. It is there by design. It's not there by accident. And if we dig deep and ask ourselves questions around that, well then, who knows what quality conversations we could be having. So, if you think about the event itself, immediately under that, you're thinking about, the patterns or trends around that. Has this happened before in history? What's been happening over time? And then you think about those patterns and those trends. There are structures that support those patterns. And so, what institutes, what policies, what systems are at play that support these patterns and structures. And then underneath those structures, what are the core beliefs that our systems and our structures are built on? And I think that last level is called the mental model. And when you're thinking about things from that mental model level, is actually insane. The quality of conversations that you have amongst yourself, or within your community, or just whoever you're having these conversations with. It's insane, like just exactly how much changes. Like, okay, this might be a bit messy because I'm doing it on the spot, but because we've spoken so much about Tamitha Paul in today's episode, let's use that as an event. So Tamitha Paul's comments about beat police, that can be our event. Okay, let's think about the patterns and the trends. Well, there definitely is a trend of, or female or POC or Indigenous politicians being dismissed. This is not the first time that this has happened. Another pattern of, dismissal when there is valid comments about the police. This happens when there's also times of Māori being scrutinized even more. And, what are the underlying structures behind that? Well, I think we've got our structure of discrimination. I've said time and time again on the podcast that not everyone has the ability to have their voice heard. And those who the system doesn't favor don't have that privilege of being able to speak fully. So there's that system of discrimination there. And then if you think about, what might be a assumption or a belief behind that system of discrimination, well, maybe that could be around a assumption or a belief that POC or Indigenous people shouldn't have the ability to speak freely or openly or be heard. And I think if you think about the response to Tamitha's comments from that mental model level, rather than just reacting to the event, I think the quality of conversation that y'all be having will be quite different. And the thing with the iceberg model is that you're not going to come to just one mental model. There are so many things that you can, so many threads that you can follow with the iceberg model. But I hope this has been a good introduction to systems thinking, and also, more importantly, why it's important that we think about things from a more systemic point of view. I hope this is something that I can do more in the podcast. Thank you so much for tuning in, and catch you for the next one.
Thank you for tuning in into another episode of Headscarves and Good Yarns. To keep spinning the yarns, let us know your thoughts. You can find us on Facebook and Instagram at Headscarves and Good Yarns, or email us at headscarvesandgoodyarn@gmail.com.
This podcast was produced by OAR FM Dunedin with support from New Zealand On the Air.